Hi, everyone. This is a fireside chat talking about Haddon's matrix or the Haddon matrix. And we're going to start by talking about two models in public health that have utility of the matrix and is applicable. So let's review them both before we get into it. The first of these is one of the simplest models of disease causation, which you are likely to be aware of. The epidemiologic triad or triangle, the traditional model for infectious disease, pretty relevant, consisting of an external agent, a susceptible host, and an environment that brings the host and agent together. The depiction in the triangle on the left on my screen shows the agent, host, and environment with equal influence, and the other model shows the agent and host as variables dependent on each other, but also dependent on the environment. And of note, different diseases require different balances and have a different set of interactions. And so it's important to do assessment of all three components and their interactions when considering what public health measures should be taken. And that's why we're talking about these type of models today, because we are moving in to solutions from our problem identification. Another model that we draw on often is ecologic models, such as Bronfenbrenner's ecological model that shows the individual in the center, affected and modified by their immediate physical and social environment or microsystem, as well as interactions within the systems within the environment or mesosystems, other broader social, political, and economic conditions on the outside that influence the structure and availability within these smaller microsystems. What we're probably more used to seeing is this traditional structure. I showed this the first day of class, this ecological model, and that defines different layers of the environment and individual, interpersonal, organizational, that all need to be taken account when you're designing an intervention, when you're thinking about a health problem and someone's risk or population level risk assessment, surveillance, and all of the multifaceted factors that go into this that aren't necessarily captured within the host agent environment simple triad. You can see here an interesting integration of the two. This is from colleague Carol Runyon and will be relevant to the Haddon's matrix, or the Haddon matrix, often called Haddon's matrix, that we will be talking about next, that really pulls from both of these models in an interesting way to help identify solutions to complex problems. This is Bill Haddon right here, often considered the father of modern epidemiology, and I will let Doug talk about this a little bit, as this matrix was created within an injury control and violence prevention framework. It's really where it originates. I loved it when I first became aware of it. It wasn't something that I was taught within the MPH curriculum in my program, the University of Minnesota. I don't think it's necessarily taught here. And so I wanted to introduce it because I think it's really valuable. So let's hear Doug's take on it, and then we'll revisit it and get into today's assignment.
Sounds good. Yeah, in the injury portion of the field of public health, we talk a lot about Dr. Bill Haddon, widely considered father of modern epidemiology, who was instrumental in figuring out how can we take on the problem of car crash in the United States. And it's a great example of breaking a problem into its component parts. And he said, for any given injury problem, motor vehicle crash, for example, let's think about what is happening and opportunities for prevention before the crash occurs, or as the crash is occurring, or after the crash has occurred. How are we going to try to deploy countermeasures? We can try to make changes to the host, that's the person in the vehicle, to the equipment, like the car, and the physical environment and the social environment. And so some of this will jump to mind right away for you because we experience countermeasures every day. Bots Dots is a classic example of a very efficient countermeasure. Dr. Bots worked for the California Department of Transportation, and he is the gentleman who designed the epoxy and found a formula that made those dots stick on the road and not come off. And of course now we see these dots everywhere, and as you're driving, on the right side you'll hit them, and on the left side you'll hit them, and when they do, they alert you that you're drifting out of your lane and you want to come back. So Bots Dots fall into the Haddon's matrix right there. Before a crash has occurred, if those are an element of the physical environment, they can help prevent crashes. And we can think of many other examples. Before the crash occurs, what can we do with individuals? We can provide driver training. Before the crash has occurred, in a vehicle, we can put in anti-lock brakes. So if you slam on the brakes, they don't lock up and you don't go into a skid. As the crash occurs, for example, if we're wearing seat belts, then we reduce the likelihood of being injured. Now that depends on the host to work. So it's an active public health intervention. It actually takes an individual a little bit of work. Not ideal. If we can have a passive public health intervention, like change the equipment to automatically deploy an airbag, that can be even more effective. But we need all of these things to come together to reduce death from motor vehicle crash. After the event occurs, for example, if we have emergency medical services, we can get individuals to trauma centers faster. I'm really glad you can use Haddon's matrix actually. When we think about any injury problem, they can seem so large and untractable that we don't know where to start. Mm-hmm. And Haddon's matrix can really inspire us because we can see if we break down any injury problem into component parts, we see that there are many opportunities to tackle a given part of an injury problem. Because there's no one-size-fits-all silver bullet.
Yeah, not at all. And, you know, in some cases, several strategies work, and you'll have to choose one, just like you're going to have to choose in your projects, and then put together in a logic model. We can borrow the Haddon matrix from injury epidemiology and apply it to basically any problem, any challenging problem where you don't know where to start. You can start by breaking it down into these component parts, as we just heard, thinking about what happens before the event, what's happening during the event, and what's happening after the event. And that's really similar to primary, secondary, and tertiary prevention in public health. And then what factors are related to the host, which is the person or people or communities affected? What factors are related to the agent, the vector, the virus, or the equipment, or an inanimate object can be an agent like a firearm? And then on a more passive note, what can we do to change the context to the environment before the event, during the event, and after the event? And many, many things will fit into these boxes, and some are overlapping, but it helps as a brainstorming tool. We saw the example with Bots Dots. We can look at other examples, and I've posted some papers on this week's module. The first example being unsafe playground equipment and how we can think about this everywhere from safety training prior to falls happening and prevention by safety grips, and also during events or if a fall were to happen, mitigate the risk of serious injury by making sure there's no protrusions, etc. So you can see this whole table populated. But what I thought was really interesting is to start thinking about the coronavirus. Look at this table and think about solutions. Think about what we're already doing. Try and populate the table. I started to do this and thinking, well, before we were in crisis, which is pre-event, what was going on? There certainly wasn't vaccination because there wasn't any, but we can apply this to any infectious disease. Did we have risk communication in case something like this happened? And then I started thinking about testing, that picture in the center. And where do you think testing would go in this matrix? I think there's some different options, so I'd love to hear what you think. Why don't you go ahead and post something on the discussion board? And then as the final activity before we come together as a group, I'd like you to start to populate this table to get some practice with it. And I've given you two options. I like options where you can populate it by thinking of the coronavirus and what we have done or can do and play off of a previous activity that you did, or you can start to break apart the problem that you'll be focusing on in this class. And this will be particularly helpful leading into the logic model when you're going to have to pick one of those solutions or factors, research questions to focus on for the remaining of the class assignments. So for this activity, I've posted additional instructions. There's different papers you can draw from in the module, and we'll meet up again as a group at 7 p.m. Of note, you can work together on this. I'd actually encourage it. I know it's a little bit harder when we are not together, but I'm sure you're all familiar with Google Hangout. And if you want to set up a system with your group where you can use Google Hangout, that will be one option. I'm also trying to put together some conferencing options for groups on Canvas, which might be ready by the time of this activity. So good luck, thanks for listening, and we'll meet together in a few at 7 p.m.